والآن فليتفضل السيد باري لينهام ليحدثنا عن أهمية الاستجابة للحوادث وتثقيف وتعاون الجمهور. Please, Barry, make your way to the stage.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much to the organizers and to everyone from the fire safety community here in the United Arab Emirates for inviting me here to speak about this question of fire safety in buildings, which is a very important issue. I think my background was there. I think many of you know I'm Group Director at Knauf Installation, but today I'm here as President of Fire Safe Europe. Fire Safe Europe, I think there are two really important things to say about Fire Safe Europe. First of all, we tried for the first time with Fire Safe Europe to bring a real cross-sectoral group of people together to look at fire safety. So we don't just look at passive fire safety or active fire safety, but we also involve firefighters, and we have a whole group of different people with us to make sure that we take a common approach to fire safety. The other thing I would say about the Fire Safe Europe is that we are very focused, as the name suggests, on fire safety in Europe. Our objective is to explain to the European Union and the regulators in the European Union how we should tackle fire safety, but I hope that some of the lessons that we've learned in the European Union around this can be useful here in Dubai and more widely in the United Arab Emirates to understand how we should tackle fire safety. Our previous speakers talked more about how we tackle building fires and how we deal with fires when we get to the fire. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the regulatory structures and the ways that we need to work to make sure that fires are not large and are safer when they get there. Some of the firefighters that we work with have been talking about the fact that in the past they came and finding their fires in buildings. But today they're saying they're often coming and finding buildings on fire. The whole building itself is on fire. And I think as our previous speaker said, the challenge for firefighters to deal with huge fires on facades and buildings is a very different challenge than they were facing in the past. I think we have to look at that and look at some of the challenges we're now facing and ask ourselves, how do we regulate for that and how do we structure ourselves? So why are we here today? Well, I think you're very aware of the fires that have happened in the UAE and some of these huge fires and facade fires. But this isn't just a challenge here in this part of the world. It really is a global challenge. These are some of the major fires that we've seen across the world and across Europe, and some of these fires have killed over 50 people. And these are really, really extensive fires, and they have some major issues, and they're causing some major problems, not only in terms of the problems for firefighters to fight them, but some of the environmental pollution that comes off them, and of course the cost, and more importantly, the cost of life. So we have a common challenge. We have a common challenge across the globe. We have a common challenge altogether to ask ourselves, how are we going to change? Because buildings have really changed dramatically over the last 30 years. If we look at how we build buildings before, and I think our first speaker looked about some of how the sort of more UK building stock looks and how the traditional building stock looks, we know that buildings used to be built, and I think two key issues that I see when I look at these pictures is, one, those buildings were quite small. So we weren't dealing with huge high-rise buildings in the past. And the other thing was they didn't have a lot of combustibles on them. They were often made from brick or from concrete or from stone. And therefore, when fires did occur, the building itself wasn't necessarily supporting those fires to grow and to become more difficult. But that's not what we're seeing today. Not only here in Dubai and in other parts of the Emirates, but also across the world, we're seeing more and more high-rise buildings, more and more difficulty in managing those high-rise buildings, and we're having to think quite clearly, I think, about how do we manage them and what we do to make that possible. And we have new drivers in the built environment. We have a huge drive for improving the energy efficiency of buildings, and for really good reasons. We know that we've recently agreed in Paris the new version of the Kyoto Protocol on climate change, and there's a lot of pressure now to reduce the amount of energy used in buildings. And the impact of that, particularly in Europe, has been a lot of new retrofitting of buildings, adding layers of insulation on the outside, making those buildings more energy efficient. Now, as a company that produces insulation, of course, we're very supportive of that. But when we do that, we have to make sure that we don't change the way that building deals with fire, because we don't want to make it worse. Again, we're seeing more and more fires, and maybe some of the questions we have to ask ourselves is how do we ensure those buildings are now retrofitted and built correctly to manage those changes? And of course, particularly in this region, this region's been really taking the lead and taking a very strong position on sustainability. And I hope you'll be also taking a very strong position and leading on fire safety as well. All this has been really spurring innovation. So we're seeing completely new systems, we're seeing completely new approaches to the built environment, whether it's metal-clad facading, whether it's sandwich panels on buildings. We see a huge change in the way that we're building our structures, the way that the external wall systems are done, and we're having to think about how we adapt to that. And some of the things that we're seeing is that we have to take into account that those different systems can have very different approaches to fire. This is just a quick view of the amount of calorific value in different insulation materials that we see on the facade. And I think one of the things that we notice is that the more that that facade has significant amounts of calorific value, the more likely that system and that the fire and the insulation in that system will actually make it harder or make it more likely that the fire will spread aggressively through the building. And of course, innovation is great. But one of the problems that we face with innovation, and not just in the fire space, but always in innovation, is that innovation tends to go very quickly. But we, as those of us who are focused on regulation and the regulatory structures, we're always playing catch up. We're always finding ourselves slightly behind the innovations because, as I say, innovations go very quickly. Regulations, whether it's here, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in Australia, whether it's in North America, always has to be catch up. And that's just something we have to take into account and realize and accept the fact that we're going to have to constantly be thinking in this space as we adapt and we change our building systems and we go to new innovations. How do we have to adapt our fire regulations to make sure that when firefighters and others turn up at buildings, those fires are as safe as possible? So when we look at fire safety in buildings at Fire Safe Europe, we look at the three pillars which we believe are critical in terms of making sure the regulatory environment and the structures are in place. One is we need to make sure that tests reflect reality. One of the things we've seen in the past is often the testing systems for high-rise buildings, but also for insulation and external facades for insulation, have not always reflected the reality. We have to make sure that the building regulations make sense. How we regulate a single-family home of 2 stories has to be, by nature, very different from how we regulate a 25-story building that has multiple occupants and multiple different ways of being used. So we have to look at that. And of course, the question of enforcement. The construction industry faces an enforcement issue all the time. We know enforcement is difficult, but it's very, very important in this particular space that those systems, if we're going to have systems that pass, and we're going to have regulations that fit, we should make those regulations as simple as possible and easy as possible so that enforcement is also as easy as possible. So looking at the tests that reflect reality. In Dijon, France, we had a fire which was started by a rubbish bin which caused a major facade fire. This is quite important because many of the fire regulations and the standard testing methods for fires in Europe were based on fires coming out of the flats. Fires that were coming through windows and out onto the facade. But a lot of the big fires that we've seen, particularly in Europe recently, were done by fires that were done on the outside of the building, which had caused the entire facade insulation system to catch fire and go. And the Dijon cause led to the French system being changed. So now, for example, the French have learned from that lesson, and they've now developed a new system where now the fire from the outside is also as part of the testing regime. And large-scale testing is very important because we say we need to make sure that the tests reflect reality. So to explain to regulators across Europe the difference between how a different test can be viewed, we did this test very recently in Croatia, where we showed the difference between 3 different systems. System 1, which you can see on your left, is a combustible system. So the entire facade is made from a combustible insulation system. The middle one has fire barriers made of a of an A1, so a fire-safe material, non-combustible material at different stages. And the one to the right was made just from a non-combustible insulation structure. And here you can see how the fire spread on those different systems. This is a fire load which we think is typical of the kind of fires that you get from rubbish bins or from a car going on fire near a facade. And you can see that the combustible insulation structure went up very, very quickly, within a very simple time. I think when I was actually at this fire test, and within 2 or 3 minutes, I think quite similar to the two speakers before us, explaining that these systems and these processes, the fires do go very quickly. They don't take 20, 30 minutes to get going, they take 3 or 4 minutes to get going. And we saw that here, and you can see that within 15 minutes, almost the entire facade of the combustible material was up and in flames. On the second one with fire barriers, we saw that within 90 minutes, it actually had jumped the fire barrier, and the whole of the insulation wall was on fire. Whereas we can see even at the end of 40 minutes, the non-combustible insulation facade hadn't helped the fire continue, had maintained the fire, and there was actually almost no system damage to the entire wall. And actually you've seen incredibly that actually even after that very high amount of fire, intense fire, you've seen almost no spread of the fire at all across the facade. And I think this kind of points to kind of a key issue that fire safety is if we want to be very, very high in terms of delivering very, very high levels of fire safety, one of the key issues that we're learning is that not using combustible materials on those facades is one of the key ways of not having a problem with that facade fire. And then we have to build in regulations that make sense. So again, in Frankfurt, we had another incident, and this was on a smaller building, on 22-meter facade, where again we had fire barriers in place, but those fire barriers still didn't protect the wall from catching on fire. So again, the question is, as we move to more and more energy efficiency requirements and more thickness on the walls, what we're seeing is that actually that huge amount of additional combustible energy is sometimes causing us to be able to jump over those fire barriers. And so we're having to rethink how much fire barriers. And in fact, in Germany, what we're seeing now is a change in those regulations. So a change in the regulations, again, fires that make sense. On smaller buildings to the left, people are pretty much free to use the materials they want. Once you start going above around 12 meters, now we have to go to a much more extensive fire barrier situation with non-combustible insulation fire barrier levels all the way up the building at every 3 meters. And this legislation has just come into place. And then if we look above 22 meters, Germany is now going to a situation where only non-combustible products can be used above 22 meters. And the reason for that is to really say, how do we make sure the highest level of fire safety is delivered for those buildings? The Czech Republic is now following suit, so is Slovakia, so are a number of other countries across Europe. Because, as I said, we've experienced in the last few years a number of fires. And unfortunately, in fire safety, one of the things I've learned over the last few years is that fire safety is driven by fires. Unfortunately, it seems to take us to have large fires before we actually really start taking this more seriously in Europe and across the world. And I think the only thing that we can do is make sure that when we do have large fires, that we do take it seriously. And I know that that's something you've been talking about here, about how you can change your regulations to make that possible. And again, what we're seeing again is higher the buildings going, the more that we are focusing on ensuring that those facades are as safe as possible and don't contribute to fire safety and the spread of fire in the built environment. And again, these are the new regulations in the Czech Republic, where we're saying that above certain heights, above 12 meters, we have to go to non-combustible facades. And when we're going to very high-rise buildings, the entire facade has to be non-combustible materials. And then, of course, there's a question of enforcement. And as I said, enforcement is a very, very difficult issue in the construction industry. I would like to be able to come and tell you the 5-point plan to ensure that enforcement happens every time. I don't know what it is. I think that the last speaker from Australia had a very good point, which is that it's good to have people in the system who are not financially focused, who have to have the last word. I think what I've seen around the world in different countries, I know that Italy has that system. I know, for example, in the UK, I'm looking for my UK colleague here, but I think the UK also has a strong involvement of the fire service in making sure that fires, I think what we see from the firefighters who are part of Fire Safe Europe is it is very important that you have that third-party person who makes sure that those buildings are done properly, and that if we are going to have systems where we ensure that we have test methods that work, we need to make sure that the buildings are built based on those test methods. But again, I think what we are seeing from the different places in the world we go is that one of the key issues is how do you make sure that in high-rise buildings you're not putting combustibles on that wall. There's a lot of potential for, I think it's hard to regulate, for example, for not having lots of people putting things on balconies. I think people will put things on balconies, but I think what we can do is we can make sure that those wall constructions are not supporting fire spread. We can make sure that roof constructions aren't supporting fire spread. And we can do that by using materials that we know that don't do that. And I think that makes it easier for everyone to make sure that enforcement happens and that we end up in a situation where our buildings are as fire safe as possible. In Shanghai, for example, we know that that fire was caused by illegal welding that was going on. Again, very hard to stop. Enforcement's always very hard to stop. And again, that's why we come back time and time again to this point, which is that as it's hard, not only is it hard, for example, to make sure a building, when it's built, is fire safe, but it's hard to know how that building will be treated and maintained over its lifetime and what activities will happen. And again, we come back to the fact, therefore, the more that you can do to make that system passively safe, that you can use products which don't contribute to that, to support that involvement and the amount of fire propagation, the better. And again, it's why we're, at Fire Safe Europe, we've now been calling across the European Union to say that 12 meters should be the level at which, above which you should only have non-combustible materials in the facade insulation systems. So I think, I hope this is a dawn of a new era for fire safety in buildings. Looking across your skyline, I think United Arab Emirates has been and Dubai in particular has been a leader in developing new buildings, and particularly, I know, as I said before, on environmental criteria, you've been a place which has shown huge amounts of leadership in terms of pushing this forward. And I hope that you'll also be able to show leadership on this space, because we struggle in Europe sometimes as well. We've made a lot of progress in some countries, but it would be great to see progress here on the regulatory structures. We can also take that experience back to Europe and show that how all of us going together and are working. Because I say, we are facing a very new challenge in terms of the built environment. In Europe, we're putting a huge amount of new cladding and insulation structure on the outside of buildings that didn't exist, and we're going to have to manage that trend. In other parts of the world, we're seeing a lot of high-rise buildings going up, which now need to be managed. And I hope that together we can face this challenge and create the right regulatory structures so that we make sure that when people turn up at fires, they're not buildings on fire, but they really are fires in buildings, and we can get back to fighting them how we used to. So I think that's all I have to say today. And again, thank you very much for listening to me today. And again, I wish you the best of luck as you look at your regulatory structures and try and put in place the right systems and processes which will lead to a very, very fire-safe systems and high-rise buildings here in the Arab Emirates. Thank you very much.